Welcome everyone to the Franchise Company First Friday. I can see as usual my internet's breaking up and I'm flicking away nicely, but hopefully you can see the visuals. And the First Friday event this afternoon, the topic that we're covering is data protection, GDPR, but it's all everything that we do on the First Friday is from a franchisor's perspective. And as with all events, this event is going to be recorded, and a link will be sent to the recording for all attendees and anyone who couldn't manage to get onto the event today. So without further ado, I shall pass over to introduce the hosts today, who are Natalia Shvarts from Beyond Corporate and Simon Bishop from GDPR Solutions, and they're going to lead the session for the next 30-35 minutes. Thanks, Natalia.
No problem. Hopefully everybody can see my screen, one of them?
Yes.
Yes, great. All right. So welcome everyone, and thank you for having us here today. And I wanted to talk to you today about data protection and why franchisors ought to be taking control over this topic and managing that as part of their offer to franchisees. So first I wanted to talk about the why. So, why are we even talking about it, and why data protection is so important? Because so many times I have heard, some franchisors say, well, our franchise agreement says that franchisees have to comply with, the laws and regulations. So that's fine. So we don't need to do anything. And my answer to that always is, well, yeah, that's all good and well, but and you're right, the first point is, it is the law says everybody has to comply with certain things. It's not a matter of size or what type of business you're in. It's not optional. Data protection, everybody has to comply. But the point is, it's really damaging to your brand when something goes wrong. And at the end of the day, franchisees, they're operating under your brand. So as far as consumers and customers are concerned, it's, they're seeing your brand, your name. So if things are not done the right way, that can cause a lot of brand damage. And we've all seen that when, unfortunately, things do go wrong, it'll be the main brand name on, in the news and in the newspapers. So I always think it's really, really important that we educate, franchisees on what the requirements are and what they need to do in order to comply, because ultimately it's for us to look after that, the brand, and brand protection is part of franchisors' obligations. And of course, if things do go wrong, because we're talking about data protection and it's, customers' personal data, typically, again, if things are not done the right way and if problems are not handled the right way, that can lead to loss of customers. And loss of customers has the knock-on effect of, damage to franchisees, damage to your business as a result, because if you've got that, loss of trust, it goes back up the food chain back up to you. So in the end, that can damage your franchisee recruitment. So all the money that you're pouring into your franchisee recruitment, into your marketing and advertising, if some of the essentials are not covered at the franchisee end, then essentially all that money that you're pouring in is just coming out on the other side, and you've got a leaky bucket. And so, and with data protection, it's sort of bringing that back to, the potential damage. It's if one franchisee doesn't do things the right way, it of course has a knock-on effect on, not just them, but their neighbors and the brand as a whole. So it really doesn't matter as much whose fault it is, but because at the end of the day, if it affects your brand, that should be a problem, a problem that you should worry about and you should be concerned about. So, but looking at it from a positive perspective and always seeing opportunities in everything that we do, this is actually a great opportunity, because when compliance with data protection legislation is managed and is managed well, that can be a huge selling point. Because we are talking about personal data, because it's something that is so important to our customers, they actually really appreciate it when they, when the service they receive is, is exceptional. So it can, but by having processes in place with your franchisees, you're ensuring that the customers are getting that consistent experience, and the customers are getting that great consistent experience. So it can build, it can build your brand. It can be a huge benefit. And you can also, again, turning everything on its head, instead of it being a problem and being damaging, it can be a benefit. So it can benefit you. You can use that as, absolutely use that. You should be using that as part of your proposition. You can say, well, actually, we don't just provide support on the finance and the HR, but we also give you support with data protection, things that most people really shy away from, and because it tends to be a topic that people find, it can be complex, and people don't want to deal with it. So it can build trust, it can build customer loyalty, and it can be a benefit. So we've talked about why, and I then wanted to just briefly talk about what. Obviously, if I typically spend a day talking about the ins and outs of data protection, so and we've got just under an hour. But in terms of what should be covered, this is just a really brief overview. So, it's as the basics, such as franchisees understanding that they actually have to register with the Information Commissioner's Office, that should be in place from day one, from before they start trading, from before they open doors. Because as soon as they start recruiting, as soon as they start collecting any personal data, they should be registered. So do they know what they need to do? Do they understand that actually they need to renew that every year? And it's not just a matter of, yes, I've renewed my registration. There are 3 tiers, and if you're not in the correct tier, then potentially that could be problematic. So they need to be, they need to know what to do. They need to know how to do it. And it is really simple. But if they don't know about it, then there is a risk that they might not be registered. They need to understand what the key principles are, but it's not just understanding what the key principles are, but how it applies to them, and how it applies to them in their specific business. Because ultimately, you're all running different businesses, and for every business, there'll be different personal data that you're collecting about your customers, and it'll be used in a different way. So your franchisees, and it's not just your franchisees, but their staff who are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, need to understand what it is that they're doing, and what the legislation means for them. I mean, when I first started doing training sessions with franchisees on data protection, GDPR, and they were open to anyone at franchisee level. So it was sometimes it was franchise owners, sometimes it was their their staff. I mean, it's as simple as not everybody knows what personal data actually is and what constitutes personal data. Not everybody realizes that a photograph is personal data. Not everybody realizes that an IP address is personal data. And the moment you start digging into, well, what types of personal data you're using in your business, the more it sort of starts to make sense. And the more they start thinking, oh my God, I didn't appreciate this is what we were doing. So it really is important to get the basics right, because if they don't understand what the basics are, then how can you possibly expect them to comply with it? So one of those topics is the use of processes, and processes is basically third parties that we use within our businesses in order to do something with personal data. But again, it's because it's understanding what third party and what qualifies as a processor. Many people don't appreciate that software is a processor. And so immediately you've got this massive gap and risk because people didn't know that a software is a processor. So it's sort of going through that and going, okay, well, the legislation has very specific rules on what you need to do when it comes to your data processors, what your obligations are and what their obligations are, and the fact that, you know, you need to identify who they are. You need to have done due diligence, i.e. you need to make sure they're GDPR compliant, because if your processor is not GDPR compliant, that automatically makes you not GDPR compliant. So it's that knock-on effect. Then we always, you know, international transfers, even if you are a UK franchisor only, international transfers will always be, will kick in, because the reality is, if you're using any product that has a link with America, like, you know, Microsoft, like Google, like any social media, though, you know, most tech companies are based in the US, and there are rules, and essentially there is, you know, the basic rule is that you're not allowed to export data from outside of the UK, and then there are exceptions, except in certain circumstances. So you sort of need, you know, the reality is you will be exporting data probably on some level, maybe not much, but still, and therefore you need to make sure that certain processes have been covered and certain things are in place for when you do that. And then we talk about, the moment I started talking about data protection impact assessments, that's when usually everybody goes to sleep. Because again, that's just seen as another term that is so scary, and people go, I don't know what I need to do, and what does it mean, and oh my god, that means I have to sit down and go through a process of 5 hours of filling a form. And I always say, well, no, that's not necessarily the case. Yes, if you're working on a very complex project, that might take longer to do that assessment, but this is really what it is. It's a risk assessment. And if it's a simple project, it might only take 5 minutes, it might take half an hour. But essentially, you know, there are certain things that whenever we introduce a new process to do with personal data, or we change a process to do with personal data, we ought to be carrying out a risk assessment. But again, it just gets forgotten, or because it's, you know, it's admin, it's paperwork, people don't want to do that. So it's finding ways that make it easy for people to comply and to follow. But, you know, data protection impact assessments is one of those areas. Then we talk about data breaches, because that's a huge part, because that is the part that usually ends up in the media and causes the harm. So again, it's recognizing what actually qualifies as data breach. And again, it's often, you really wouldn't believe that, you know, that people don't appreciate, you know, what is a data breach and what isn't a data breach. So, you know, sending an email to the wrong person is a data breach. It's not a very, you know, it may not be a very serious data breach, but nonetheless, it's a data breach. So it's knowing what is a data breach. It's understanding that actually the law says that every single data breach needs to be recorded. So you need to have a way, you know, something, whether that's a spreadsheet or whether that's something else, but you need to have a list of all the data breaches that are happening within your business. Some data breaches need to be reported to the regulator. So that is about assessing what needs to be reported, what doesn't need to be reported, because at the end of the day, you don't want to be reporting everything, because if you start reporting every single data breach, the regulator will think, oh my God, these guys have no idea what they're doing. You know, so then the regulator is much more likely to come knocking on your door, wanting to do an audit and wanting to find out what is going on with you. So it is really important to assess things correctly and only report those breaches which are reportable, which actually, you know, a very small proportion of breaches usually are reportable. So it's not as scary as it sounds, but you need to have gone through that assessment process. And then there are a number of rights which the law grants to the individuals. So to all the, to all of you as individuals, to all of your customers, people have rights when it comes to personal data. And the big shift that we saw with the change of regime from the previous regime to the current regime is that actually the law gives a lot more power to the consumer, to the person whose data it is, and they have they can enforce their rights. The one right that we see used most within probably any business is the what are often referred to as subject access requests. So essentially the right for the person to say, I want to know what information you're holding about me and what you're doing with it, etc. So again, it's, franchisees, if they don't know what a subject access request looks like, if they don't, if they can't recognize that when it comes in, they wouldn't know what to do with it. If they don't know what the process is for responding, how do you respond to the subject access request? They might find themselves, if nothing else, just really stressful situation, because actually responding to subject access requests can take time, and it's time that you could be doing something else. So the best thing you can do is avoid getting into situations where you get subject access requests. But if you do get one, it's knowing what to do with it. And then, the underlying principle within the legislation is that principle of accountability and record keeping. So it's about having, being able to evidence your compliance. If you can't evidence your compliance, then you might as well not be compliant at all, because the law says you need to be able to actually show that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing. So it's about having the privacy notices. It's about having the registers, the breach register. It's about having a record that basically shows what data you're collecting, what you're doing with it, why you're collecting it, where is it going, what's happening to it. So shows sort of the flow of the data from the point that it comes in to the point that it leaves. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to it. And, and for most franchisees, that's just a small part of what else they've got to do on a daily basis. So, so when we talk about, well, what can we do? What can we do to comply, both us as franchisors, but then what can we do to enable our franchisees to be compliant and make it easier for them? It's sort of, it really sort of splits into, three main bits. And the first bit is, is training, training people. It's giving them that understanding, making sure they're comfortable and they understand what it is all about and what they need to do. And, for a lot of businesses, it may not be, that resource is not something that you might have, within your business. So then it's important to be able to say, okay, well, we don't have that resource internally, but we at least can signpost to where our franchisees can go and get that training. Or maybe we've got a supplier that we can bring in and they can provide that training. But it's, it's making sure that it's done at the right time. There are different levels. Obviously, new franchisees, when they're coming in, it's much easier to get things set up correctly from day one, rather than, having set things up, then to realize, oh, I now have to go back and sort of like untangle everything and start again. So it's important that the new franchisees get the information at the relevant point in time, so that they can use that knowledge when they're setting up systems, when they are, first starting to operate. But for existing franchisees, it's making sure that they understand what their obligations are as their business grows and develops and becomes a much bigger business. And also it's making sure that it's not just the franchisees, the individuals who own the franchise that have that knowledge, because actually reality is that it's their employees, it's the people on the ground who will be faced with these type of issues on a day-to-day basis. So if my franchisee is not passing that knowledge on to their employees, then again, I as a franchisor should be concerned about that, because ultimately it's my brand on the line. So training is one thing, but training does take time, and training relies on people, people being out of the business, and how many people can you train? So training cannot work in isolation. So then, in addition to the training, what can we do? Well, we can cover a lot of the stuff actually by ensuring that we've got it covered, that our operations manual addresses it, that we have policies, standard policies that we've made available to our franchisees that they can use. And what franchisees, in my experience, find really, really helpful is having checklists and having sort of process flows of, what is a data breach? If you have a data breach, actually, this is the process, this is what you need to do. And as long as they know where to go, what to look at, then it's much easier for them to, to follow that process. We had a great example when, after I ran a training course on data protection, and a couple of days later, I had a call from a franchisee saying, "Oh my God, you know what, just as it happened, a couple of days after we've been on your training course, the individual in the office, they logged onto the computer system and saw that something really random was happening. They were like, just files didn't make sense, and things have jumped from a folder to a folder." And he said, if I hadn't been on your course, I had realized that something was not right. But because we've just covered it, I immediately decided to dig deeper. And actually, we had a cyber hack, and somebody hacked into our systems and were copying files across. But I was able to stop it, and they only copied a small part, and then we were able to dig deeper and see what it is that they've copied. So he immediately activated this whole, oh my God, something is going on, but now I know what to do because I know where to go, what to look at, and I've got a checklist with a process that I can follow. And so that limited the exposure, greatly, because they were able to act on it very, very quickly. So yes, there is, clearly some of it is your responsibility, and you need to make sure that you internally, as a franchisor, compliant. There will be, of course, a part of this that is absolutely franchisees' responsibility. You can only provide so much to them. They need to be the ones who are implemented, and they need to be the ones who are doing things right on the ground. So therefore, the sort of the last piece of the jigsaw is your ability to audit, because one thing that you should be doing as part of your setup is actually, checking that franchisees do comply with data protection. But if you don't know what you are checking for, then again, do you know what you are looking at? Do you know what, questions you should be asking? Do you know what the answers mean? So, it's about making sure that you've got you built the data protection auditing as part of any other auditing that you do, because presumably you are checking on quality that of services the franchisees are providing. So if you can build that as part of your ongoing processes, that is something that you should be doing as part of your responsibility and your own compliance. So turning then to to how you can do that, and there are a range of options that are out there, but ultimately I find that compliance with how effective compliance is and systems rollout, it all goes back to the top. So if the top management is bought in, then that makes everything a lot easier. So but in terms of how you can do that, there's a lot of you can have if you have internal resources, you can use those resources. If you don't have internal resources, look to external resources. What is out there's so much out there actually. I mean, even just the Information Commissioner's Office, there are actually quite a lot of really helpful resources on their website that perhaps are underutilized, and there's a lot that you could, just as a franchisor, take from the ICO's website, or direct your franchisees to the ICO's website, because they've got some really good resources. Although I would say, yes, of course, it is tough sometimes, because when you're looking at, okay, well, I need to bring in an expert on data protection, especially in 2018, we all of a sudden saw all these experts in data protection just popping up left, right, and center, and you don't even have to have any sort of specific qualifications. So understanding who is actually an expert and who is not an expert can be tough. But we can talk about sort of what questions to ask, etc. So there are internal resources, external resources, training. Again, there are a lot of companies that provide training, and training is, I believe, is something that, should be provided. It is really, really beneficial. All the franchisees, again, in my experience, franchisees actually really do engage with training. So the more you can either signpost them to appropriate training or provide some training internally, that is one thing that you can show that what you are doing to ensure that your franchisees know what they need to do. So it's information. We talked about templates and checklists. It's support. Franchisees might have questions, so it's knowing, again, when you're thinking about what support I'm going to provide, can you handle that internally? Do you need to go externally? We provide support on HR. A lot of franchisors engage with external, companies that provide employment advice, and yet we don't necessarily do that when it comes to data protection advice, but it's just as important, because it can cause a lot of damage. And then, in terms of how to ensure that compliance is, as I said, it's having the audit capability. So it's making sure that you build that into your systems, and having the reporting capability. So being able to see at a glance, actually, where is my network with this? Where am I with this? Have I done what I need to do? And out of my network, how many of them have registered with the ICO? How many breaches have happened across the network? I mean, do you have visibility of that? Because actually, as a franchisor, you should be interested in what's going on across the network when it comes to to something that's so serious. And one of the options of how you can handle this is by maybe turning to a piece of software that can help with all of this. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Simon, because Simon is the expert on software solutions and will talk to us about how you can choose, what you need to consider when choosing software and what to look for.
Thanks, Natalia. Hello, everyone. I think I'll start off by saying that, let's be really honest, data protection is not something that falls at the top of everyone's agenda, either franchisor or franchisee. It's something that falls down the pecking order a little bit sometimes. Doesn't mean it's not important, doesn't mean people don't care. But as Natalia said, your franchisees are balancing lots of plates in order just to run a business. And this is quite a complicated area to get into. So any tools that you can find that will help you as franchisor and your franchisees has got to be a good thing. But I think that there's lots of stuff out in the marketplace, lots of choice as ever. But I think as a franchisor, you should be looking for things that are going to save you time. It shouldn't be a burden. It should be fairly easy to manage. There shouldn't be too much to do. There is inevitably a process, and Natalia talks about records of processing activities. So there's quite a lot of work goes into that one piece of work there in order to understand. And I know, Simon, you've asked a question about retention periods, which we'll come to in a bit. But all of this kind of information has to go into that records of processing activities. But unless you know the right questions to ask, then you're never going to fill one out completely. It's not a quick job to do. So it has to be easy for you guys to manage as franchisors at your level, because you will have different data and different data flows potentially than your franchisees. But equally, at the same time, at the franchisee level, they have to be able to manage it at their level, both for their clients and for their staff as well. You should look towards things like network management. Look, it's an interesting relationship, the relationship between franchisor and franchisee. A lot of franchisors want an element of control, not in a negative way, but they want an element of control to know what's going on with their network, to know where the gaps are, to know where the risks are, because not every franchisee makes it. Some come and go, some start, don't make it, and they fall by the wayside, and others take on extra territories. These things happen. Knowing where you are with your network is going to be important for you. And do you get supported? Most software, you think of accounting software or HR software, whatever it may be, when you sign up to it, you often get a sort of a little person in the bottom corner saying, do you want some help with this? And that's about as far as the support goes. So if you're really stuck with how to fill out, what to fill out, then is the right support there for you and for your franchisees? And I think that the biggest thing, really, certainly in our experience, is none of the above. Really, it's really about peace of mind. It's about feeling comfortable and satisfied that as a business and as a brand, you've done as much as you can do. Look, there is no magic wand with data protection. Anybody that says they've got the answers to everything is probably lying. It's a risk-based law. Things change. The law has changed since it came in 2018. There are more changes planned, obviously because we've left the EU. So things are going to change. So does that translate into peace of mind for you and your network? That's going to be quite important. I'm not doing the slides, by the way, so I'm relying on Natalia just to press the button at exactly the right time here. So franchising, it's not a single business environment, is it? It's not one business, one set of data, one set of customers. There is, I should say, that relationship. So whatever you're going to choose, it needs to be fit for franchising. So it needs to be able to represent you as a franchisor, and it needs to be able to help your franchisees, and it needs to do all of them equally well. We've mentioned that sometimes franchisees don't make it, and obviously you grow your network, so you get more franchisees. So is it capable of coping with that change? Because that change can happen fairly regularly and fairly frequently. And do both parties benefit? Do both get supported? It should help. There should be no losers in that scenario. Everybody should win and be better off in their data protection knowledge at the end of it. It should fairly obviously be easy to use. We don't want anything that's too complicated. There are some softwares out there tend to be used by the bigger companies, sort of the GlaxoSmithKlines of this world, that are, unless you're an expert in data protection, you won't understand what to do with the software, what to fill out and how to fill it out. So they're really good softwares, but they're not actually practical for normal, everyday, small, medium businesses. And it has to be in a language that people understand, right? So do you get ongoing support? You should do, really. And I don't mean that in a you can send an email and get a ticket kind of support. The support should be, because things happen quickly in franchising. If you've got 50 franchisees, the questions you're going to get in any one day are going to vary wildly and massively. So the support should be there for them and for you. And there should be a future plan. The law changes, as I said, and has changed and will continue to change, particularly as it's interpreted as things happen in case law. But actually, whoever you're going to choose should be geared up, I guess, to an ongoing roadmap that's going to reflect that. And then lastly, sorry, Natalia, you're going to say?
No. Sorry, go ahead.
just breathe.
I would like to add something before we go on to the next slide.
Okay, all right. And then the last thing that I would say is, look, you have a group of franchisees. They're individual businesses. Legally, they are the legal entity, so it is their responsibility to manage their own data protection requirements. And then you have you as a franchisor that has this brand to protect. How do you know what's going on with each of them? Because you can give them documentation, you can tell them what to do. How do you actually know where they are and what they're doing? And if they're not doing it, how do you know that whether that's a risk to your brand or not? So anything that can help with network management would be really, really useful. I'm waiting for Natalia to jump in now.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I just wanted to say that, again, just from my own experience, because prior to joining Beyond Corporate, I was actually part of a franchisor organization for 7 years. So data protection sat with me, and managing that was one of my responsibilities. And, you know, the point about introducing software is that it's meant to help you. And Simon said it needs to be easy to use. If it's not easy to use for franchisees, they're not going to engage, they're not going to use it, and then they're just going to come back to you. So you're not really benefiting from that. What I found, and it was incredible, from the moment that we brought the software in, and because obviously we went with the right, we chose the right software. I was getting a lot less phone calls, emails, you know, that dropped off. So I was then free. I had so much more time to do other things that I needed to be doing, because I knew that part was covered, and actually they were getting brilliant support from the software that we put in place for the network. So it can really help you. You will actually start to feel how much more time you get as a result of, you know, getting the right things in place. So back over to you, Simon.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I think the franchise relationship, as I say, isn't a standard business relationship. So all parties need to have that ability to be able to audit themselves. So Natalia's talked about that. Kind of the franchisee needs to be able to check their own homework and evidence where they are, and the franchisor needs to be able to check that the homework's been done properly, because the risk to the brand is well, essentially it's a risk to the brand otherwise. You've got to be able to evidence what you're doing to meet your legal requirements, and two key themes within the law, and bear in mind it's a risk-based law, so it's not a hard and fast law, but two key themes are transparency and accountability. So can they evidence it? Can they show you? If you ask them what they're doing for data protection, can they show you something? Within that, what they should be able to show you is for every single purpose, every reason that they're processing data. So that might be, I don't know, communication. So email for communication. What's their lawful basis for doing that? That might be different to prospects than it might well be to existing clients for them. It may well be different for you as franchisor and your relationship with your franchisees. The devil's in the detail with this one, but fundamentally they have to have that documented. Natalia's already mentioned due diligence on processes, so what's in place for that to happen. How can they evidence that? How can they so the law will say you've got to ensure that data is kept as safely as you deem fit for the data and the purposes that you're using it for. Well, that's as long as it is wide, and the law works in that grey area really, because it's a risk-based law. So how do you evidence that? They'll need to have full asset lists, so that includes all their softwares, all their hardware, laptops, desktops, photocopiers, lots of other things, any backup storage, any additional hard drives, things like that, any supporting documentation, and of course they, as Natalia's already mentioned, they need to be able to document data breaches, and you will need to know where the breaches are in your network, because if you've got a franchise that's documenting a breach or a couple of breaches a week, that probably should be an area of concern. By the same token, if they're not documenting any, that's also an area of concern, because you know breaches happen, right? That's just the world we live in. So so if you're going to go and have the conversation with anybody, I would encourage you to go and ask these questions. I would ask them who they currently work with. Fairly obviously, if they can come out with brands that you recognize and that are trusted brands, then there's probably something there that you should be listening to. What support is there on an ongoing basis? Software companies across the board in every industry will, buy the software, pay a monthly fee, and then you don't ever speak to anyone. So what support is there for you and for your franchisee? And we've already sort of touched on this. If a franchisee leaves the network, well, how do we accommodate that? How is that? How does that work within the software? So my network view, how is that reflected? How do I manage that? I'm assuming that most franchisors want to grow. Growth rates vary in different conversations that we've had, but from anything from 5 a year up to 50 a year, depending on who you talk to. But actually, does it scale? Is it designed for a franchise network? Always a good one. Do they use their own system? Because if the company you're talking to doesn't use their own system, the question would be why? Because it should be and help them meet their legal requirements. And what evidence have you got? It's feelings are, they're not an absolute, are they? But if everybody feels positive about it or feels happy about using it, or they're relieved because some of the pressure's been taken off and they can actually evidence stuff now, then that's a good thing, right? If they feel positive about it. If they're not fussed about it or not bothered about it, then that's not necessarily a good thing. And where are they planning to go? What clients do they have on board? What have they got in the pipeline? What industries do they work in? Whilst data protection law technically is the same for pretty much all industries, there will be variations within industries that are specific to those industries and unique. So those need to be taken into account as well.
Simon, I have one more question.
Okay.
What about free trials? So a lot of the time when you're looking at software, when I was looking for software, instead of the supplier answering my questions, they were just going, hey, have a free trial. We'll set you up with a free trial and then you can look for yourself. What would you say about that?
I think the backdrop of any software that you use for data protection is it's a law. And it's fine. Look, free trials might work for you, but the reality is are you going to use that software for data protection in that time frame that you've got it in a free trial for, and be bothered to work out the questions it's asking you to make full advantage of that free trial? The answer is probably not. It's often used as a bit of a fob off from a lot of software companies saying, you just have a look at it, just try it for nothing. But there's no real support there. That's just having a go at something. If I'm going to buy something, I want to know how it's going to work for me. How is it going to advantage my business? How is it going to benefit my franchisees? How much is it going to cost? How does that work? I want my questions answered. I don't just want to have a go at it. It's a bit more in depth than just having a free trial to have a free go. I think there's probably more questions that will come out of that free trial than answers, than anything. And it's probably best to get those questions answered up front for your own peace of mind.
And talking about questions, we've had some questions through. So I just wanted to, I'll stop sharing in a minute so we can all see each other and I'll go through the questions. But I just wanted to say, I've shared a little checklist with Julie. So I'm sure Julie will be able to share that with you guys, just in case that is of any use. And that's just a little, a one-page summary of the type of things that should be covered, really. What I'll do is stop sharing my screen. And this way, I now have questions. So Simon asked, how long can you keep someone's personal information, customer data? And I think Simon has already sort of touched upon that. I mean, this is the thing with data protection, okay? The law does, it's not black and white. There is no magic, a lot of the time, if you actually look at the legislation says it depends. And it's all linked, and it's understanding how it all links. So the reality is that the legislation says you should only keep data for as long as it's necessary. So then you need to figure out, well, what is necessary? Well, necessary depends on why am I collecting the data? So what am I using it for? So it's a really circular, argument that you need to go through, but
it's an interesting one, Natalia, because often it's driven by one of two things, or often both. So it can be driven by another law. So if you think your financial aspects with HMRC, kind of 6 years plus current year, that's kind of a standard one that lots of people default to. But also it could be driven by your industry standards. So for instance, we've done some work in the past with car body shops, franchises for car body shops, and quite often, quite commonplace in that industry is for the paint sprayers. I'm sure they've got a better job title than that. Is they have to have lung capacity tests. and they have to be fitted for masks and stuff, as you'd expect, because, well, back in the day, years ago, the masks were just those little white masks that you used to hold on and spray a car, right? But it's a known thing in that industry that 20 years after somebody's left the company, they can come back saying, I've got respiratory problems, and it's your fault because you didn't fit my mask properly. So in that industry, they keep the data for like 25 years because it's just known in that industry, and it's expected. There are charities that keep data for literally a lifetime. So the period is academic. It's why you got to that period, and actually for your business and your experience, for each one of the franchisees, it might be slightly different. Now, as a franchisor, what we should be able to do is set for certain uses of information, because there's a standardization across the whole network, is that everybody's documenting the relevant retention periods for that particular purpose that it's there. There will always be exceptions to the rule. That's the nature of the beast. But it's about getting that consistency across the network. So in answer to your question, Simon, as long as you want, as long as you can justify it.
But that is the key, as long as you can justify it. So for me, it always comes back to having an explanation and having a justification. So again, you know, when we were looking at franchisee recruitment, and we were looking at, okay, so how long do we keep this data? And actually for this particular franchisor, they were saying to me, well, in our experience, because of the level of the investment, it's not something that a lot of people look at and then decide, oh yeah, I want to buy a franchise. And in our experience, we can show that from, you know, historically, people receive our communication and they sign up, and, you know, because they want to receive it, and we have their data, and, you know, provided they don't unsubscribe, we have their data, we continue to send them information. Sometimes it takes them 4 years before they come back and actually engage with us. So if we are not able to keep it, then we're going to be losing potentially, you know, really good leads. So, and this was the thing, we started looking at it and we're going like, okay, well, that's fine. And as long as we're giving people, you know, choices and complying with the law in, for example, obviously every time communication goes out, the person has a choice because they have that unsubscribe link. They can choose whether to continue to engage or not. But if they haven't unsubscribed, then yeah, you can carry on, because you know, you are able to go back and document that actually it takes people, you know, 4 to 5 years to engage, and that is your life cycle. But that might be different for, you know, from franchisor to franchisor, and you know, and you look at the franchisor compliance, and then separately you have to look at, you know, within franchisees' businesses, what are their requirements, what, you know, what sort of data they collect, why are they using it. They'll have their, you know, there will be differences, because obviously there will be a difference between what you do with data and the type of data that you collect and the type of data that your franchisees collect. The next question, and Simon, feel free to expand on this if you know, you asked about lead exchange, you know, where franchisors can operate a lead exchange where they're not sharing, where they're sharing prospect information without falling foul of GDPR. Do you mean that exchange with whom? So we're talking about obviously data sharing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just one of the old chestnuts that's been flying around for a long time. But if somebody's not suitable for us, they might be suitable for somebody else, another franchise, for example. So, you know, there's been a lot of, in the past, a lot of informal sort of data sharing, if you like, or prospect sharing. It's basically just to say, look, this person's interested in franchising, they're not right for us, but we don't want them to go out, you know, they're interested. So we need to try and facilitate that interest further by making an introduction to a more suitable brand, for example.
And so again, for me, this would go back to, you need to give people a choice, because what the law says is that people have, you know, people should know what's going to be, what you're going to do with their data. So the data they provide to you, they need to know what you're going to do. And they, you know, and there are, you know, we talk about lawful basis. There are a number, you know, and again, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but they're basically, the law says there are a number of lawful reasons why you can, you know, why you can collect people's data. When it comes to prospect data, I suppose, and you know, and sharing it with other franchisors, the only lawful basis really that's available in that situation is consent. And in order to comply with the requirements for consent, it needs to be informed, clear, etc. So in that circumstance, what I'd be doing is, when I'm collecting that data from that person, all you need to do is ask them, if you are not suitable for us, would you like us to share your data with franchisors that we might, that we think may be suitable for you, or that may be interested, and give them that choice.
Yeah.
Or potentially, look at how that can be built into the recruitment process.
Yeah, I mean, it's more likely to happen if you're a multi-brand franchise, for example, and you've got different brands. They might not be right for one brand, but they could be right for another part of the company.
Exactly. So then you can, but give that reassurance to the customer, and actually go, you know what, we are, we the person because people trust people, right? And it's about building that trust. So if somebody is coming, a prospect is coming, goes, I'm interested in franchising and I'm interested in this particular brand. And if I'm a franchisor that has a portfolio of other brands, I'd be saying, well, actually, you know what, within our group of companies, we have other brands. And although, this doesn't seem to be the right fit, actually, we think you'd be great for this one, or, why don't you explore this? And that's probably a softer way to signpost. And, that's the way you can get that consent, by explaining to them, we're not giving it to a stranger. We're not just, sending it off to, all the franchisors under the sun. We're only going to pass it on to our affiliates or, our group companies. But essentially give that explanation. I think if people understand what they're doing, they will, they're more likely to say yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that if it's one group, there's an argument that says they've contacted that one legal entity that covers all these brands, then that's just an internal data transfer, essentially. So that's okay. I mean, I would always encourage you have that conversation with that person, right? Because they've walked in talking about subject A, and actually you're moving them on to subject B. So actually just say, look, if you're not right for us, then we're going to pass you to one of our internal partners. It's fine. It's not another company. If it's another franchise, another legal entity, then that's where the data sharing agreement and the consent comes into play a little bit more. So I'm not sure you can fall foul of GDPR or data protection law in this country. I think it's best to try and the honest answer is just be honest and upfront about what you're doing with the data, and then it's very difficult to fall foul of it. And then all the other stuff is back up to that in terms of the data sharing agreements and everything else. But if you are sharing data with another legal entity and they're not a processor, you must have well, technically you don't have to have a data sharing agreement, which is a set of rules essentially, but it's kind of frowned upon if you don't. But it's not a legal requirement to have a data sharing agreement. But you do have to let the person whose data it is know that that's what you plan to do, and you need their permission for it.
Although I would say, and the other way to think about it as well, because even if the data is shared within the same group of companies, at the end of the day, the best way to sense check it is the person going to be surprised? So if the person is talking to me about a domiciliary care franchise, and all of a sudden tomorrow they get a call from Simon talking to them about car valeting, they'd be if the right introductions are not made, that person might be thinking, what how the hell did they get my information? But if the person who's making the call explains, this is where this is how we got you, this is why we've got your information, then the person is less likely to be surprised, and then that's less likely to lead to to problems, to issues. Because of the a lot of stuff with data protection, unless it's cyber breach or something like that, a lot of issues actually completely preventable and come from the inside rather than from outside. So it's about how we deal with things and how we explain things and how we position it with with the person in front of us whose data it is. So subject access requests, how do you respond? What format do you use? I mean, there is a process. So essentially, the legislation sets out exactly what information you need to provide. So, you kind of have a list of, what it is that you need to tell them, what you need to do. The difficulty, again, in my experience, the difficulties arise because when it comes to the detail of, once you start looking, okay, well, what do I need to do? Because a subject access request, and when somebody comes to you and says, I want to know what data you have on me, what are you doing with it? And you have to go back and tell them, essentially, this is what we have about you, this is what we, and this is how we use it, this is where it's stored, this is who we've shared it with. But and then they're entitled to have a copy of that. So, but then it's when you're looking at the copies, and you might have emails, but those emails might have other people's data in them, or, there may be correspondence that has other people's data. So, and you can't share that because, so you need to redact, and it's understanding, what you can redact and, what you should be redacting, etc. It gets really quite complex. A lot of businesses have moved to, that's why they've moved to having portals where, people can set up their own profile, and within that profile, you often find a button that will say, download my own data. And that's one way that, some businesses have dealt with it, but it doesn't necessarily work for every business. So it's really looking at what works for my business, how does my business work, where does the data sit, how much of it can we automate, how much of it needs to be something else, how can we simplify the process? But essentially it will be looking at the business and looking at what it is.
Can I just a quick one again, just in the context of franchising? I mean, you could, for example, if you're in a dispute with a franchisee, if I was a franchisee, the first thing I'd do is submit a subject
access request. Yeah.
Okay. So presumably, yeah, go on.
But, okay, so thank you, Simon. That's a really good point. But the point of a subject access request is that you are only entitled to know what personal data I have about you and what I do with that personal data. So you submit up a subject access request to me, and I've dealt with this before. Again, we were in a dispute, franchisee termination, and the franchisee went, okay, I'll put a subject access request.
Yeah.
It caused me a headache in a sense that I had to spend time dealing with it. But what they got back from me was 200 pages, of which most of it was redacted, and only their name, their email address, etc. was left in, because they're only entitled to see what personal data we are processing. They're not entitled to anything else.
Are they entitled to see comments that are made about them, for example?
It depends.
Yeah, it depends on the comments. So yeah, and this is why, again, this is part of the education, because when we talk to people about data protection, we go, do you understand what is personal data? Because that comes back down to what is personal data and what do we have to provide back? Because yes, the more I describe, if I start describing you, I can either just, I can start at the top and kind of go like, male, well, that doesn't identify you. But the more detailed I get, the more people know who I'm talking about. So okay. Yeah, I just.
So if it's a misrepresentation or something like that, then you've got to be really careful what you document, because you could, for example, you could put a note in there as a franchise dev person and say, look, he's a great guy. He hasn't quite got all the money, but you know what? I think we'll give him a chance. He might succeed. He might not succeed. I mean, that can be quite damaging, can't it? Particularly if it's
you take a view from a data protection point of view with a subject access. The key word there is subject. That's the data subject. So it's about them. Any comments or anything else, there is I can't for the life of me remember, there is an element that anybody can ask to see what comments there are about them as a company on a CRM. That's fine. But if it is in your business interest to not let that person see the data that has their name in it because it is commercially sensitive, there's no reason you have to let them have access to that.
Okay, and does that cut across WhatsApp messages?
I don't get me started on WhatsApp, please.
Right, but no, I mean, without going into detail, presume it's all platforms, whether it's written, a letter, an email, a WhatsApp, a text message, or whatever.
And again, and that is why we talk about it is really important to have your data flows. Because if you have a data flow, your data flow will record where you store information. So then if you do have a subject access request, you can turn to your data flow and you go, oh, this is where I need to look. makes your life easier, because it almost acts as a checklist, and you can say, all right, I need to look in my emails, I need to look in my, you can tick it off, and it can be a process that you go through. But yeah, this is why we always talk about actually having things in place. If you do it correctly, can be really helpful, further down the line, because when it comes to actually complying with things, in practice, it makes it a hell of a lot easier.
And Natalia, we've got
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
We've got one last question from David Hunt. I'm
Yeah.
using a CRM platform that gives the franchisor access to all the franchisees' data. My question would be, who owns that data and who would be responsible in the event of a GDPR dispute, I think.
Yeah. And again, David, great question. And I wish I could give you an answer, but it's, it will again be, unfortunately, it really depends. So when we especially, I specifically didn't really want to talk that much about fines or anything like that. But the point is that, if there is an issue that happens between a customer and the franchisee, and that issue escalates to a point where the regulator is looking at it, the regulator will be, might look to the franchisor, because it's your brand, it's your, it's your name on the door. And yes, you can, and as to who is responsible or to what degree somebody is responsible will come down to then you being able to show, well, actually, we've provided them with, with the training. Actually, we've provided them with, in our operations manual, that there is a part that deals with this. We've told them what they need to do. We've made all this information available. The issue is at their end, they've not implemented it correctly. So then you're sort of, it helps you. If the argument is, financial penalty, it helps you to remove that, so that it doesn't hit you. But at the end of the day, it will be, it's not, financial penalty is one thing, but damage to brand reputation is another. I
think that the key thing here is with because I'm conscious of time, the franchisor and the franchisee, is who's actually determined who's the controller for the data. Now, there might be one or the other, or it might be a joint controller, and that should be reflected in the franchise agreement anyway as part of the contract between the two companies. But without knowing the detail, because if it's a franchisor that's a controller, fair enough, that's sort of okay. If it's the franchisee that's a controller, then you become a processor. But it's likely that you're a joint data controller, because it's probably a centralized CRM that everybody uses, which is fairly common amongst franchise networks. But you both have a dual responsibility, but one of you will need to be the lead controller in that situation, which will most likely be you as franchisor, I would have thought, generally speaking.
I suppose it would depend on what issue there is, because if it was an issue with the system, was it an issue of, essentially, is it human error? Is it a system error? It's digging deeper into what the cause is. So unfortunately, it depends. The answer is it depends. But absolutely happy to, obviously, there are people out there who can help you with understanding if you do have a specific issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Natalia, and thanks, Simon. Really, really interesting discussion. And I think obviously it's one that we've seen from the questions that we could go on for some time, but we are running out of time. And I just wanted to share the details of Natalia and Simon, because I think certainly Natalia comes on a lot of these sessions, and most people may know her anyway, but Simon's new. As he said earlier, he's a First Friday virgin. Those are the details for Simon and Natalia. And as with all the guests that come on First Friday, the whole intention of these sessions is to be informative and to share information and knowledge, and everyone that comes on is happy for us to share the information and to take follow-up calls, questions, emails from anyone who wants to take this on a one-to-one discussion basis, basically. So those are the contact details for Natalia and Simon, and thanks again, and thanks for all of the questions from the floor. The next event is in May, and we're missing April because it's the Easter weekend, but the next event is in May. We're inviting expressions of interest for the May and the June sessions in terms of anyone who would either like to come on as a guest for First Friday, or know someone in the franchise sector who would, you know, be a good guest for First Friday, or has a topic that they'd like us to cover in First Friday, because we've got a month or so to get that organised. So we've got a couple of guest speakers lined up, but in terms of firm dates, we've got a date and an opportunity in May. So if any of you would like to be a guest speaker to share your knowledge, expertise, just get in touch with me. And if anyone knows, you know, anyone that again would be suitable, likewise, please get in touch with me as well. And that's it, guys. So thank you very much for coming on. Thanks for attending. Hopefully everyone's found it useful and beneficial. The recording will be shared next week. It'll be edited, be shared next week. It'll go onto the website, our website, our First Friday sessions. All of the other events are on there as well, and it's very wide ranging in terms of topics. So if there's anything you want to see as a back topic, then please go and have a look at those. And hopefully by the time May comes, Virgin will have got my internet connection sorted, so I'll be able to use my video as well as talk on the calls. But yeah, thanks for coming on the call. Thanks for supporting us, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Very much.
Bye.